She was rescued from scandal by a duke's intervention, yet the true danger lay in the love she'd already given away, to a man she could never openly choose. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We did love to hear from you. If you enjoy Victorian-era tale stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The Duke of Ravenshire's residence blazed with crystalline brilliance on that warm evening in May of 1848. Long mahogany tables stretched beneath cascading chandeliers, their golden light dancing across silk gowns and starched cravats as London's finest families gathered for what promised to be the season's most talked-about dinner. The orchestra played softly from the gallery above, a refined melody that hummed beneath the gentle clink of crystal and the murmured conversations of the privileged. Maria Riley sat 3 seats from the head table, her rose-pink gown perfectly pressed, her dark hair arranged in the fashionable braided style her mother had insisted upon. She held her wine glass with practiced elegance, nodding at precisely the right moments as her companion spoke. To anyone observing, she appeared the picture of contentment, a young woman of good breeding, properly engaged in polite conversation with an appropriate suitor. She was not content. She was suffocating. Across the expanse of white linen and gleaming silverware sat Duke Jeff Washington, the master of this grand estate and the reason every family in attendance had accepted their invitations with unseemly haste. At 34, the Duke of Ravenshire possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that commanded attention without seeking it. Sharp features, penetrating dark eyes, and an air of calculated restraint that made lesser men nervous and ambitious mothers hopeful. He sat with military posture, listening to Lord Pembroke's tedious hunting story with the same focused attention he gave to matters of Parliament, though Maria could see the slight tightness at the corner of his mouth that suggested his patience was thinning. He was known throughout London for 3 things: his immense wealth, his unwavering moral principles, and his complete disinterest in the marriage market that consumed every other gentleman of his rank. Maria's attention should have been on her suitor, Mr. Edmund Fitzroy, who sat beside her describing his family's estates in Hertfordshire, with the confidence of a man who believed himself already accepted. Edmund was everything society demanded: well-connected, financially secure, impeccably mannered. His golden hair caught the candlelight as he gestured expansively, his hand occasionally brushing her arm with a familiarity that made her skin prickle with discomfort. "Of course, once we're settled, you'll have complete authority over the household staff," Edmund was saying, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, though I do prefer things run with a firm hand. Servants can become quite presumptuous if not properly managed. Wouldn't you agree? Maria murmured something non-committal, her gaze drifting, as it always did, as it always would, to the shadows near the serving table. John Robertson moved through the room like a whisper, his dark livery blending into the background as he refilled glasses and adjusted place settings with the invisible efficiency expected of the Duke's household staff. His movements were economical, respectful, nearly unnoticeable to the glittering assembly around him. To them he was simply another servant, another fixture of the Duke's well-run estate. To Maria, he was everything. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a glance so brief that anyone observing would dismiss it as coincidental. But in that stolen moment, Maria felt her carefully constructed composure fracture. She saw in John's steady gaze the same quiet anguish she carried, the same impossible longing, the same resigned acceptance of a love that society would never permit them to speak aloud. John's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he turned away, continuing his duties as though nothing had passed between them. Nothing had, and everything had. "Miss Riley, you seem distracted this evening," Edmund said, his tone carrying the faintest edge of displeasure. "I do hope my conversation isn't boring you." "Not at all, Mr. Fitzroy," Maria replied automatically, forcing her attention back to the man society had chosen for her. "Forgive me. The warmth of the room has made me rather light-headed. Perhaps you require some air." Edmund's concern seemed genuine enough, though his hand on her elbow felt more possessive than solicitous. "I could escort you to the terrace?" Before Maria could respond, the Duke's voice cut through the ambient conversation with quiet authority. "Miss Riley, I wonder if I might request your opinion on the wine selection this evening. Your father's expertise in such matters is well known, and I understand he's taught you to appreciate fine vintages." It was a transparent excuse, delivered with perfect politeness, but it accomplished its purpose. Edmund could hardly object to the Duke of Ravenshire addressing his guest directly. Maria met the Duke's gaze, surprised to find something unexpected there. Not romantic interest, but a penetrating observation that suggested he saw more than she'd realized. Had he noticed her discomfort, her forced smiles, the way Edmund spoke over her? "I would be honored, Your Grace," Maria replied, grateful for the reprieve, however brief. The Duke inclined his head slightly. "After dinner, perhaps. I find these formal affairs rather stifling for genuine conversation." As he returned his attention to Lord Pembroke, Maria felt Edmund stiffen beside her, his earlier charm cooling into something harder. "The Duke is remarkably attentive to young ladies," he murmured, his tone suggesting criticism rather than compliment. One might wonder at his intentions. "His Grace is simply being a gracious host," Maria said quietly, though her heart raced with questions she couldn't yet articulate. Why had the Duke intervened? What had he seen? Across the room, John refilled the Duke's wine-glass with steady hands, his expression carefully neutral. But Maria knew, had always known, that he was as aware of her as she was of him, that every moment in this glittering prison was agony for them both. The orchestra shifted to a new melody, something melancholic and haunting that seemed to echo the ache in Maria's chest. Around her, laughter and conversation flowed like champagne, the privileged and the powerful celebrating their exclusive world without ever questioning whether those trapped within it were truly free. Maria lifted her wineglass to her lips, tasting nothing, feeling everything. She was being courted by a man she did not love. She was loved by a man she could never claim. And somewhere between duty and desire, between what society demanded and what her heart had already chosen, Maria Riley was drowning in a silence that grew heavier with each passing moment. She had no idea that before the week was through, the Duke of Ravenshire would shatter one future to save her, never knowing he couldn't save her from the heartbreak that had already taken root. The courtship with Edmund Fitzroy had begun as these things always did, with a letter from her father, praising the young man's prospects, and afternoon tea arranged between families who had already decided the outcome before the first pleasantries were exchanged. Maria remembered that initial meeting with crystalline clarity. Edmund had arrived at the Riley residence in March, impeccably dressed, carrying flowers for her mother and compliments for her father's business acumen. He had looked at Maria with appraising eyes, the way one might examine a mare before purchase, and pronounced her quite lovely indeed. No one had asked Maria what she thought of him. The weeks that followed blurred into a routine of choreographed encounters. Walks through Hyde Park with her maid trailing 3 paces behind. Edmund's arm linked through hers as he spoke endlessly of his family's lineage and his expectations for their future. Afternoon teas in drawing rooms perfumed with rosewater, where matrons nodded approvingly and whispered about what a splendid match they made. Evening gatherings where Edmund would appear at her side, claiming her attention as though she were already his property. "Your dowry is quite generous," he'd mentioned during one such walk, his tone casual but his interest unmistakable. "Combined with my family's estates, we'll be positioned quite advantageously. Your father has been most forthcoming about the arrangements." Maria had smiled politely, saying nothing about how no one had consulted her regarding these arrangements. The red flags appeared, gradually, like cracks spreading across porcelain. Edmund's impatience when she paused to admire the spring flowers instead of focusing on his conversation. The way he corrected her opinions on literature, politics, even the weather, as though her thoughts required his refinement. His barely concealed irritation when she'd suggested visiting an art exhibition rather than another tedious garden party. Women shouldn't trouble themselves with such intellectual pursuits, he'd said, laughing as though she'd made a charming joke. Leave the thinking to us, my dear. In contrast, Maria's memories of John Robertson were painted in entirely different shades. The quiet afternoon 3 months ago, when she'd discovered him reading in the servants' quarters, a volume of Wordsworth he'd borrowed from the Duke's library. Their conversation about poetry had lasted 20 minutes, conducted in hushed tones, and he had listened to her interpretations with genuine interest, never once dismissing her thoughts. The evening she'd stumbled on the stairs, and John's steadying hand had caught her elbow with such careful respect that he'd released her the moment she regained balance, stepping back with a murmured apology for the familiarity. The shared silences in corridors where words were impossible, but understanding passed between them like secret currency. John had never presumed, never claimed, never demanded. He had simply seen her, truly seen her, in ways Edmund never would. Now, as Maria sat in the Duke's glittering dining room, Edmund's possessive hand resting too familiarly on her chair, she understood with devastating clarity what her future held. This courtship was a performance scripted by others, and she was merely an actress expected to deliver her lines with conviction. The applause would come at the altar, and her heart would remain forever in the shadows, belonging to a man she could never claim. Duke Jeff Washington had learned long ago that the most revealing conversations at social gatherings were the ones never intended for public consumption. Standing near the card room at Lord Haverford's soiree 2 days after his dinner party, Jeff observed the assembled guests with the practiced detachment that had served him well in both Parliament and society. His position afforded him a unique vantage point, respected enough that men spoke freely in his presence, yet detached enough that they forgot he was listening. Tonight, he was listening very carefully. Edmund Fitzroy had excused himself from Miss Riley's side for the 3rd time in an hour, disappearing into the card room with Lord Brentwood and several other gentlemen whose reputations were less than sterling. Jeff watched Maria standing alone near the refreshment table, her practiced smile firmly in place, her posture perfect despite the subtle tension in her shoulders. He'd seen that tension before. In his sister, years ago, before he'd intervened to prevent her disastrous engagement to a man whose charm concealed cruelty. In countless young women paraded through London's marriage market like prize livestock, their preferences ignored, their futures decided by men who viewed them as commodities rather than human beings. Jeff despised predatory marriages. He despised them with the cold fury of a man who'd witnessed their consequences too often. Fitzroy's luck seems remarkably improved this season, Lord Haverford remarked casually, appearing at Jeff's elbow with 2 glasses of brandy. Paid off his more pressing debts, I hear, just in time for his courtship of the Riley girl. Jeff accepted the brandy, his expression unchanged. Convenient timing. Indeed. Haverford's tone carried layers of meaning, though one wonders where a gentleman with Fitzroy's spending habits acquired such sudden liquidity. The Riley dowry is substantial, I understand. The implication hung heavy between them. Over the following days, Jeff made discreet inquiries. His solicitor, sworn to confidentiality, uncovered what polite society preferred to ignore. Gambling debts accumulating at alarming rates, payments made to silent scandals involving women of questionable virtue, a pattern of courtships that coincided suspiciously with financial difficulties. Edmund Fitzroy was, quite simply, a fortune hunter with expensive tastes and flexible morals. Jeff stood in his study 3 evenings later, the solicitor's report spread before him, wrestling with a question that had no easy answer. Intervening would be seen as improper, possibly damaging to Miss Riley's reputation. Society would whisper about his motives, question his interest in a young woman he barely knew. But remaining silent would condemn her to a marriage that would destroy her spirit, if not her life, entirely. He thought of Maria's careful composure at dinner, the way her gaze had drifted to his servant with such profound longing. He'd noticed that too. The Duke missed very little. Whatever her feelings for Fitzroy, they were clearly non-existent. She deserved better than a gilded cage built on lies. Jeff set down his glass with quiet finality. He would speak to her privately. Society's opinions be damned. The summons arrived on cream-colored stationery, delivered by the Duke's footman with impeccable discretion. Miss Riley, I would be grateful for a private audience at your earliest convenience, a matter of some delicacy requiring immediate attention. J. Washington, Duke of Ravenshire. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she read the note. Her mother, interpreting it as a social invitation, had insisted she wear her finest afternoon dress, the ivory silk with pearl buttons. Neither of them suspected what awaited her. The Duke received her in his private drawing room, a space markedly different from the grand reception halls. Here, leather-bound books lined the walls, and afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting everything in honest, unforgiving light. Miss Riley, thank you for coming. Jeff stood as she entered, his formality softened by genuine concern. Please sit. What I have to tell you is neither easy to speak nor, I suspect, easy to hear. Maria settled into the chair he indicated, her pulse quickening. Your Grace, you alarm me. That is not my intention, though alarm may be warranted. He remained standing, his posture military straight, his hands clasped behind his back. I will not insult you with unnecessary preamble. I have made inquiries into Mr. Edmund Fitzroy's character and circumstances. The room seemed to tilt slightly. He is not what he presents himself to be, Jeff continued, his voice gentle but unyielding. His debts are substantial, gambling primarily, but also loans taken against his family's diminishing estates. There have been at least 2 previous courtships that ended when his financial desperation became apparent. And there are women. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Women who were promised much and left with very little, their reputations quietly salvaged by family intervention and monetary persuasion. Maria felt the blood drain from her face. Shock came first, sharp and disorienting. Then relief, flooding through her with such intensity it left her breathless. And finally, shame, hot and uncomfortable, at having been so thoroughly deceived. Why are you telling me this? Her voice emerged barely above a whisper. Jeff met her gaze directly, his dark eyes filled with something she hadn't expected. Simple, unadorned compassion. Decency, Miss Riley. Nothing more complicated than that. I have influence enough to uncover truth, and conscience enough not to remain silent when I discover it. I don't know how to thank you. The words felt inadequate, hollow against the weight of what he'd given her. No thanks are necessary. Any decent man would do the same. But Maria felt the irony cut deep, sharp as broken glass. The Duke had saved her future, rescued her from a marriage that would have been built on lies and financial transaction. Yet he knew nothing of the pain she already carried, the love she'd already given to a man she could never claim. He'd protected her from one form of imprisonment, never suspecting she was already trapped in another. The courtship must end, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Yes, Jeff agreed, it must. John Robertson had known about Edmund Fitzroy's true character since the first week of the courtship. Servants always knew. They existed in the spaces between propriety and privacy, invisible witnesses to conversations never meant for public consumption. In the card rooms where gentlemen shed their civility along with their money, in the corridors where whispered confessions echoed, in the kitchens where other household staff traded gossip like currency. Truth lived in these margins, unfiltered and undeniable. John had heard Fitzroy's name mentioned with knowing smirks, had watched him stumble drunk into Lord Haverford's residence after a particularly disastrous night at the gaming tables, had served wine to gentlemen who laughed about Fitzroy's remarkable talent for finding desperate heiresses at precisely the right moment. Every syllable had been a sharp object to John's chest. He'd wanted to warn Maria. God, how he'd wanted to. The words had burned in his throat during every stolen glance, every brief encounter in the Duke's corridors. But speaking would have accomplished nothing except their mutual destruction. A servant accusing a gentleman of moral bankruptcy? He'd be dismissed without reference, possibly worse. And Maria, her reputation would be shredded by association with a man so far beneath her station who dared speak to her of intimate matters. So John had remained silent, his restraint not weakness, but the purest form of love he possessed. Protecting her meant denying himself the relief of confession, the desperate need to save her from a fate he could see approaching like a storm on the horizon. He'd watched her suffer through Fitzroy's courtship. Each polite smile she offered the man a small death John experienced alongside her. The afternoon after the Duke's intervention, Maria found John in the conservatory where he was trimming the climbing roses, a task usually assigned to junior staff, but one he'd volunteered for because it offered solitude. John, her voice, barely audible, stopped him mid-motion. He turned slowly, shears still in hand, maintaining the proper distance even as every instinct screamed to close the space between them. Miss Riley. You knew. It wasn't a question. About Mr. Fitzroy. You knew. His silence was answer enough. Why didn't you? She stopped herself, understanding flooding her expression. Of course he couldn't have. The very question was unfair. I would have if I could, John said quietly, his words carrying the weight of months of helpless watching. I wanted to. Their eyes met, holding for a moment too long, carrying everything they couldn't say aloud. Relief that the courtship would end. Anguish that their own love remained impossible. Understanding that the Duke's intervention had saved her from one prison while leaving her trapped in another. What happens now? Maria whispered. John returned to his roses, his movements careful, controlled. You'll be safe, that's what matters. But they both knew safety wasn't happiness. Protection wasn't freedom. And love, when given to the wrong person by society's measure, became the cruelest cage of all. Maria left without another word, and John continued trimming roses, each cut precise and deliberate, much like the way he'd learned to sever hope from his heart, piece by careful piece. The confrontation happened in her father's study on a grey Thursday afternoon, with all the controlled civility that London's upper classes wielded like weapons. Maria's father, armed with the Duke's findings and his own solicitor's verification, had presented the evidence to Edmund Fitzroy with cold precision. The gambling debts, the previous courtships strategically abandoned, the discreet payments to women whose reputations required salvaging. Edmund had attempted indignation first, then charm, and finally, when neither worked, a calculated retreat disguised as wounded dignity. I see I have been most grievously misunderstood, he'd said, his voice tight with barely suppressed fury. Perhaps it is best we part ways before further misunderstandings arise. The engagement, never formally announced, ended as quietly as morning mist evaporating in sunlight. Society naturally speculated. Whispers circulated through drawing rooms and afternoon teas. Had there been a disagreement? A scandal narrowly avoided? The Riley family maintained dignified silence, and without concrete details, the gossip eventually shifted to more scandalous prey. Within a fortnight, Edmund Fitzroy had departed for the continent, his debts apparently requiring distance from persistent creditors. You handled yourself admirably, my dear, Maria's mother said, squeezing her daughter's hand with relief and approval. Such composure during a difficult situation. You are stronger than I gave you credit for." The Duke, when he encountered Maria at Lady Pemberton's afternoon reception, offered a slight bow and a look of quiet satisfaction. He had done what any decent man would do, his expression seemed to say. He had protected an innocent woman from a predatory marriage. His conscience was clear. Maria smiled her gratitude, feeling both relief and grief twist together in her chest like tangled thread. She was free from Edmund's possessive claims, free from a marriage built on deception. Yet freedom felt remarkably like emptiness when the person she truly wanted remained impossibly out of reach. John Robertson had become a ghost in her life, though they still occupied the same spaces. He appeared at the Duke's gatherings, performing his duties with flawless efficiency, but his eyes never sought hers anymore. When they passed in corridors, he kept his gaze fixed ahead, his posture rigidly proper, as though determined to erase even the memory of their previous connection. Maria understood his withdrawal was self-preservation. Proximity bred danger for both of them. With her courtship ended, she was suddenly more visible to society's watchful eyes, her next steps scrutinized, her behavior monitored. Any hint of impropriety would be catastrophic. So they maintained their distance, two people orbiting the same world, but never touching, never speaking, never acknowledging the love that had nowhere to exist except in the dangerous silence between them. The external threat had been vanquished. The internal prison remained locked tight, and in that suffocating quiet, Maria discovered that safety without happiness felt remarkably like another form of captivity, one with no Duke to intervene, no evidence to present, no escape she could articulate without destroying everything. Maria learned of John's reassignment the way she learned most truths about him, by accident, through overheard conversation, never meant for her ears. Robertson's being sent to Ravenshire Hall, one of the Duke's footmen mentioned to another in the corridor outside the morning room. Leaving tomorrow. His Grace needs experienced staff at the country estate for the summer season. The words struck Maria like a physical blow. Tomorrow. John was leaving tomorrow, and no one had thought to tell her because no one knew there was anything to tell. That evening, she found him in the servants' passage near the kitchen stairs, a space she had no legitimate reason to occupy, a risk she took anyway because some things mattered more than propriety. "John!" His name emerged as barely more than breath. He turned, surprise flickering across his features before settling into that careful neutrality he'd perfected over the past weeks. They stood 3 feet apart, close enough to touch, worlds away from possibility. "Miss Riley, you shouldn't be here." "I know." Maria's hands twisted together, all her practiced composure dissolving. "I heard you're leaving." "Yes, tomorrow morning." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they couldn't say. The dim lamplight cast shadows across John's face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet pain in his eyes that mirrored her own. "I wanted to thank you," Maria said finally, her voice fracturing slightly, "for your silence, for protecting me when speaking would have cost you everything." "There's nothing to thank me for." John's restraint was visible in every rigid line of his body, in the way he kept his hands carefully at his sides. "You deserved better than Fitzroy. The Duke saw that. I'm glad he intervened." "Are you?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Glad?" John's expression cracked, just for a moment, revealing the devastation beneath. "I'm grateful you're safe. That's all that matters." But it wasn't all that mattered, and they both knew it. "I wish—" Maria stopped, because finishing that sentence would break them both. "I know," John said quietly. "I wish it too." They stood in that narrow passage, two people who loved each other with an intensity that could never be spoken aloud, never be acted upon, never be anything except this, a moment of shared grief for a future that would never exist. "Be happy, Maria." John's use of her given name, The first and last time she would ever hear it from his lips, nearly destroyed her. "Please, be happy." "I don't know how," she whispered. "Neither do I." His voice carried the weight of acceptance, resignation, and love all tangled together. "But we'll learn. We have to." Maria wanted to reach for him, to close the unbearable distance, to damn society and consequence and everything that kept them apart. But she didn't, because some forms of love express themselves through restraint, through the agony of not touching, through respecting the beloved enough to let them go. "Goodbye, John." "Goodbye, Miss Riley." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Maria stood alone in the dim passage, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle the sob threatening to escape, and understood with devastating clarity that this was how their story would end. Not with declarations or drama, but with quiet acceptance of an impossible love. Tomorrow, John would leave for the country estate, and Maria would remain in London, safe and admired and utterly, profoundly alone. The scandal broke 3 weeks after John's departure, erupting across London society with the spectacular force of a powder keg finally ignited. Edmund Fitzroy's carefully constructed facade had collapsed not with a whisper, but with thunderous public disgrace. A French creditor, tired of empty promises and delayed payments, had taken the unprecedented step of publishing Fitzroy's gambling debts in the Morning Chronicle. The numbers were staggering: thousands of pounds lost at tables across London and Paris, loans taken against estates already mortgaged beyond redemption. But the financial ruin was merely the opening act. Within days, other revelations surfaced like bodies rising from deep water. A merchant's daughter in Bristol, whose family had paid handsomely to suppress rumours of promises made and broken. A widow in Bath who'd been courted, compromised, and abandoned once her actual fortune proved less substantial than advertised. Letters emerged, published with savage glee by gossip sheets, revealing a pattern of calculated seduction and mercenary courtship spanning years. London society, which thrived on scandal the way gardens thrived on rain, consumed every lurid detail with rapturous attention. "Did you hear?" Lady Haverford whispered loudly enough for half the drawing-room to hear. "Fitzroy's fled to the continent. Apparently there are warrants for fraud in 3 counties. "That poor Riley girl," another matron added with theatrical sympathy. "What a narrow escape. Thank heavens her father had the wisdom to investigate." Maria sat in Lady Pemberton's parlour, surrounded by women praising her composure, her good fortune, her father's excellent judgment. They spoke about her as though she weren't present, dissecting her near disaster with the same enthusiasm they applied to analysing inferior tea or poorly arranged flowers. "And the Duke of Ravenshire," Lady Pemberton declared with emphatic approval. "Such honour, such perception. He recognized the danger when others saw only charm. That is the mark of true nobility, protecting the vulnerable without expectation of reward." The Duke, present at a gentlemen's gathering that evening, accepted congratulations with characteristic restraint. He had done what conscience demanded, nothing more. If his intervention had spared Miss Riley from catastrophe, then he was gratified. Any decent man would have acted similarly. Maria smiled and nodded and accepted the congratulations with graceful appreciation. Inside, she felt nothing, or rather, felt everything at once until it became a numbing hollowness. Yes, she had been saved. Yes, the Duke's intervention had been honourable and timely. Yes, she should be grateful. But gratitude felt remarkably empty when the person whose absence defined her every waking moment was miles away in the countryside, as unreachable as if he inhabited a different world entirely. Society saw her as fortunate, rescued, free. Maria knew better. She had traded one form of captivity for another, this one gilded with praise and social approval, but no less confining for its elegance. Edmund Fitzroy's scandal was London's entertainment for the season, Maria's heartbreak was her own private catastrophe, witnessed by no one, acknowledged by no one, mattering to no one except the two people who could never speak of it. The public victory was complete. The private loss, absolute. Summer arrived in London with its customary warmth, transforming the city into a tapestry of garden parties and leisurely promenades. Maria Riley moved through the season with newfound independence. No suitor claiming her time, no unwanted courtship demanding her smiles, no future being negotiated over her head without her consent. Society regarded her with a mixture of sympathy and admiration. The young woman who had so narrowly escaped disaster now commanded a certain respect. Invitations arrived with regularity, hostesses pleased to include someone whose composure under scrutiny had proven so admirable. Her opinions, previously dismissed as charming but inconsequential, were now solicited with genuine interest. "You must tell us your thoughts on the exhibition, Miss Riley," Lady Haverford insisted at an afternoon gathering. "I understand you have quite the discerning eye for art." Maria obliged, discussing Turner's latest work with an eloquence that surprised even herself. Freedom, it seemed, had given her voice a clarity it had previously lacked. The Duke of Ravenshire, when their paths crossed at various social functions, always offered a courteous nod and look of quiet satisfaction. His intervention had achieved precisely what he'd intended. A young woman saved from predatory marriage, restored to independence, her future uncompromised by another man's greed. He never suspected the truth. How could he? Maria's performance was flawless, her gratitude genuine, her recovery complete by every visible measure. What the Duke couldn't see was how Maria stood at her bedroom window each evening as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, thinking of a man whose hands had held books with the same reverence others reserved for jewels. A man who had listened to her thoughts without needing to correct them. A man whose restraint had been the truest expression of love she'd ever known. John Robertson existed somewhere in the Ravenshire countryside now, tending to duties she could only imagine, living a life that would never intersect with hers again except in memory. Maria had learned something profound in these months of careful independence. Love did not require proximity to survive. It lived in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in memories carefully preserved, in the ache that accompanied every beautiful sunset because beauty demanded to be shared with someone who understood it. She was safe, she was admired, she was free by every definition society recognized, and she was profoundly, irreversibly alone. The irony was not lost on her. The Duke had saved her from one form of captivity, only to leave her trapped in another. But this prison had no visible bars, no obvious injustice to protest, no intervention that could liberate her. Some loves, Maria understood now, were never meant to be lived, only carried quietly and carefully, like pressed flowers preserved between the pages of a book no one else would ever read. She turned from the window as the last light faded, carrying her secret with the same grace she'd learned to carry everything else, with dignity, with silence, and with the bitter-sweet knowledge that safety and happiness were not, after all, the same thing. The Duke had given her freedom, but her heart remained elsewhere, in the careful hands of a man she could never claim, in a love that would survive precisely because it could never be spoken aloud. And perhaps, Maria thought as she prepared for another evening of social performance, that was its own form of truth. Love that asked nothing, promised nothing, and endured everything. Safe, admired, and entirely, completely hers. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.